The Hunter. The Sasquatch phenomenon has been dying down recently, it seems. At least that's what people tell me. They say it's just a hoax. If they were real, then why haven't we seen one by now? Come across a body in the woods or something. Well, friend, what happened to me just a month ago would shake the shit out of your hole. Slide down your leg and rest at the feet in a pool of terror. I've been a hunter for over 30 years, you see. These woods don't contain nothing that I haven't seen, or so I thought. It happened on Saturday the 14th. Like I said, a month back. I loaded up my truck with the essentials and my dog Roscoe, and we headed up to the mountains. A very particular spot, as a matter of fact. A place I've been going to since I was in short pants. I'm telling you, friends, this was the best spot to hunt in all of Washington State. This was like my second home. My grandpa taught me everything I knew right at this very spot. And I've never seen anything strange in all my days of coming out here. After about an hour in the truck, I arrived at my site. It was just as beautiful as I remembered, but for some reason, I don't know why, seemed off. There was a strangeness in the air. I feel stupid thinking back on it now. I should have known something wasn't right about the woods that day. It was quiet, too damn quiet. And my boy Roscoe wouldn't even get out of the damn truck. He just laid there whimpering, up against the passenger door. He's never done that before. Roscoe was the best hunting dog I've ever had. I should have been paying attention, damn it. He knew. He could smell it in the air. I know it. But sadly, my dumbass wasn't paying attention. So I got some food out, and that got Roscoe to come out of the truck. Then I set up the tent, collected some wood for my fire later on, and got the rest of my supplies out of the truck. The sun was still out, so I wanted to get some hunting in right away. I grabbed my rifle, and me and Roscoe started out. Now, like I said, up to this point, I hadn't noticed shit. But I finally went on the alert when I saw some scratch marks on a few of the trees leading away from my campsite. It looked like bear marks to me, so my guard was definitely up at this point. We continued into the forest when we finally happened upon a deer drinking in the stream. I raised my rifle. Boom! One to the head, and it fell over dead. I sent old Roscoe to go and secure the body, but to my surprise, he just stopped, halfway to the carcass, and he just sat there. I ran over and looked down at him, and he was sniffing, just sniffing the lightly blowing breeze. Right when I was about to say, "What are you smelling, boy?" it hit me. It was the most putrid thing that's ever hit my nostrils in my entire life. It was a combination of shit, rotten eggs, and a family-less old woman that's been lying dead for 2 weeks before someone's found her. I got sick right on the spot, but in the middle of me blowing chunks, I heard Roscoe start to growl. I looked up, and coming towards the deer's body was one of the biggest damn bears I've ever seen. It bent down and sank its teeth in its hind legs. I crouched down to pick up my rifle, but when I did, I heard a loud snap. Damn it. I stepped on a twig, I thought. I slowly looked back up towards the bear, and it was now staring right back at me. It started towards me and Roscoe. But right when I was about to take off at full speed towards us, the loudest roar I've ever heard in my whole life came from the bushes, just to the left of the bear. I swear to God, it was so loud it swayed the trees. I could feel it vibrate my boots. I stopped and looked towards the bushes. The bear stopped and looked towards the bushes, and I shit you not, what emerged was a 7-foot-tall, hairy-as-hell ape-like creature. Everything that's ever been described was looking right at me, and the bear. It was a damn Sasquatch. No ifs, ands, or buts. I was looking at the legendary creature. I stood in amazement as the Sasquatch leapt from the bushes and tore the bear's jaw clean off its head and started to eat it. Just then I heard Roscoe start to growl, and that lifted me out of my trance. All at once it hit me. That putrid smell, the bear, the damn Sasquatch. I just stared at the woodland beast eating its prey. But now its head started to rise, and it slowly looked into my eyes, sniffing in my direction. I could hear it growl in the distance. Just then Roscoe barked. I snapped back into reality, told Roscoe to follow, turned and ran back towards the truck. I heard splashing from behind me as it crossed the stream. I ran and ran as fast as I could, but it followed. The whole forest shook as it ran after me. It felt like, thankfully, I was well enough ahead and lost him in the bushes. Got in the truck, and me and Roscoe got the hell out of there. Haven't been back since. Gee, mister, that's a real spooky story and all, but we know you're just trying to scare us. You just don't want us going up to the mountain and partying in your woods. Please, kids, this ain't no joke. Turn this car around and go to one of the more crowded, family-oriented camping sites. I'm begging you. Thanks, mister, for your concern, but we're not kids. We'll be fine. You take care now. Bye. That was 2 weeks ago, and those dumbass kids are still missing. I warned them, didn't I, Roscoe? They're not going to find them. Hell, there's probably nothing left. Damn it, nobody believes me. Why doesn't anybody believe me? The radios in the basement. I grew up in a small town called Bellingham in the state of Washington, in the North Puget Sound area just south of the Canadian border. Being the small town that it was, there was never very much to do, and opportunities for entertainment were few and far between. This became apparent when my parents first moved there with me when I was 7. The first year of living there was uneventful and dull, but that all changed when I stumbled upon the American Museum of Electrical Invention. We walked in quite by chance on account of our favorite restaurant being closed, and I was instantly fascinated by their staggering collection of old radios, televisions, and other old electronics. Looking at it from the outside, you'd never think it was anything special, but once you walk in, you're greeted by a true wonderland of old technology. I was completely hooked after my first visit, and from that point on, I went there almost every day, as it was only 5 minutes from our house. I memorized the name and model number of every single electronic device that lined the walls and shelves of the museum, and I would constantly ask the staff to turn on the beautiful old radios so I could hear them receive stations or watch the televisions play old shows. I eventually became good friends with the owner of the museum, John, as well as the co-founder, Tana, and several other staff members. That was where I spent most of my childhood, hanging out at the museum. As I got older, I got more into electronics and started helping John restore and repair various old electronics in the repair shop at the back of the museum. I liked this even more because I felt like I was making a contribution to the museum and to preserve such amazing technology. One thing I always wondered about was how such a large collection came to be in such a small town. But as it would turn out, I had only seen a small portion of it. I still clearly remember the day I saw the basement for the first time. Me and John were sitting at the repair bench doing some work on a radio. It was going well until John removed a part from underneath the chassis and hooked it up to a tester. John cursed under his breath as the tester showed a bad reading. "What's wrong?" I asked him. "This is a very rare part, specific to the radio," he said, unhooking the component from the tester. "Very few were made, so unless we can find a replacement, we've got our work cut out for us." John showed me the part. "See if you can find one that looks like this, and with the same numbers on it," he said, getting out of his chair. We both looked through countless drawers and boxes full of electronical components, but the search turned up empty-handed. We sat back down and contemplated how we would finish the project. "What do we do now, then?" I asked. John furrowed his brow in thought. "Well," he began, "it'll be a pain, but we can always go down." "Down?" I asked. I didn't really understand what he meant. "To the basement," he said, getting back up again and walking over to a dark corner of the shop. "Follow me," he said. I got up from my chair and started following him to the corner of the shop he was walking to. I didn't know what to say. I had been consistently coming here for over 5 years, and I had never been told there was a basement. We stepped over some old boxes and some dusty radio cabinets on the floor until we reached the corner, where there was a door that was partially hidden by a shelf. John opened the door, and we started down a flight of wooden stairs that creaked with every step we took. John felt around for the light switch in the near pitch black as we reached the bottom. An array of barely working fluorescent lights flickered on, dimly illuminating the space around us. The walls were bare concrete, and there was tattered red carpet on the floor that looked like it had been there for a very long time. The roof was made of falling apart yellowed plaster, but that's not what shocked me. What shocked me was just how big this basement actually was. There were rows of shelves filled with old radios, massive shelves. Not only were they at least 40 feet long, but they were probably 12 feet tall, completely filled to capacity with radios. I stood in the corner by the stairs, completely awestruck. I looked in one direction and then the other and saw that the shelves stretched as far as the light would reach. I couldn't even see a back wall. My trance was broken when John started walking down a row of shelves, looking up and down them as he went. "There might be something down here we can use," he said. I followed him as we passed row after row of shelves, packed with radios, some of which were models I had never seen before. The only sound to be heard was our footsteps and the hum of the fluorescent lights. We walked continuously for about 10 minutes, and my mind started to run wild as I struggled to comprehend just how many radios must be down here. The place just kept going, like a massive library with endless bookshelves, except this was all old radios. I almost bumped into John as he stopped and bent over to pick up a dusty radio from the bottom of the shelf. He inspected it carefully, turning it over and looking inside. "This might just do it," he said, turning to me with a smile. I glanced in front of him in the direction we had just been walking, and I was even more shocked to see that there was still no sign of a back wall or an end to this place, even after we had walked so far. We started walking back the way we came and eventually reached the stairs again. We walked up and back into the repair shop, and John set the radio on the bench and started extracting the part we needed. For some reason, I felt glad to not be in that basement anymore. Don't get me wrong, it was fascinating, but the place had a weird energy. Something about it just didn't really make sense. How big was it really? How many radios were really down there? And why? Question after question flooded my mind, but I figured I'd save them for later and worry about the project at hand. We eventually finished with the radio we were working on and put it back on the display floor. I helped John clean up the shop, and after that I went home. I'd be lying if I said I didn't think about that basement, but eventually the thoughts drifted from my mind. About 6 months later, my parents and I moved out of Bellingham, and eventually out of Washington State completely. I missed the museum at first, but eventually I got into a new routine of life. I got a job and attended tech school and focused on meeting new people. The months turned into years, and I eventually got my own car. I had almost forgotten about the museum until a random article in a magazine got my attention. It was about a house that had been left unchanged since the 40s and was like a step back in time. I thought about the museum that I had spent so many happy hours in, and I had an idea. It had been over 6 years since I had been to the museum, so I figured it was about time to take a trip out to Washington to see how the place was doing. Once I had everything ready, I set off. It was about an 8-hour drive from where I lived, so I arrived pretty late in the day, past the time at which the museum closed. I just booked a hotel for the night so I could go to the museum the next day. I got up early the next morning and started driving to the museum, which wasn't too far from the hotel. While on the way, I remembered that basement, how surreal it felt being down there, how there seemed to be no end to it, and how for some reason I'd never been told about it. I figured I'd have to have another look down there after all. It couldn't be that big, right? I was quite young when I originally went down there, so perhaps my young mind had just exaggerated its size. I arrived at the museum and greeted all of my old friends at the front desk, and then went to the shop in the back to greet John. We walked around the museum, and we talked for hours about the times we'd spent together and the electronics we had worked on. Eventually, I asked him about Tana, the co-founder, as I hadn't seen him yet. It had been a very cheerful conversation up until this point. But as soon as I asked about Tana, a look of visible distress washed over John's face. He did his best to hide it, but I knew something was wrong. Tana is... He's not here right now, said John. He promptly changed the subject and started talking about a radio he rebuilt. I went along with it, and we talked for maybe another hour before I remembered the basement. Do you remember that time we couldn't find that rare part we needed, and we had to go into the basement to get a replacement? I asked him. John then gave me a puzzled look and said, I think I remember what you're talking about, but we don't have a basement. What? What do you mean? I said, taken aback. I remember going down there to try and find that part we needed. We don't have a basement, said John, more firmly this time. I remember the time you're talking about, he said, but I found that part in a box, not a basement. If this is some sort of joke, it isn't funny, I said. slightly annoyed now. The entrance to the basement was right there, I said, pointing to the dark corner where I remembered the door being. I don't know what you're remembering, but there sure as hell isn't a door there, said John, pointing to the corner. I looked, and he was right. There was no door to be seen, only a set of metal shelves filled with boxes. Maybe you just imagined it or something, because as you can see, there is no basement in this building, and there never has been, said John. He then went to talk to someone at the front desk, and I sat down to collect my thoughts. Perhaps I really did just imagine it, I thought to myself, or perhaps it was all just a dream. All I knew is I couldn't make any sense of it. I walked over to the corner again and looked at the shelves. Surely that door had been right here. It couldn't have just disappeared. The hell with what John said. I know what I saw. I walked out onto the main museum floor and saw John talking with the lady at the front desk. Knowing John, it would be a long conversation. This is my chance, I thought. I ran back into the shop and over to the corner and looked at the shelves again. I knew what I had to do. I grabbed one corner of the shelves and pulled it across the floor. It was extremely heavy, but I eventually managed to pull it out a good distance. I looked behind it, and sure enough, there it was, the door. Its handle had been removed, but it was the same door nonetheless. I put my finger in the hole where the handle used to be and pulled it outwards. It creaked open, and the smell of musty carpets filled my nose. I walked down the creaky wooden steps until I reached the bottom. I felt around for the light switch and flicked it on, but nothing happened. Damn it, I muttered to myself. Those old lights must have finally given up. I pulled out my phone and turned the flashlight on, illuminating a small area in front of me. I started to walk down one of the rows of shelves. The last thing I wanted to do was to get lost, so I decided to stay close to the wall, parallel to the stairs. But eventually, mainly due to getting distracted by the radios, I ended up straying away from it. It was exactly as I remembered, endless rows of shelves packed with radios, like the prophecy room in Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. I just kept walking onwards and onwards, scanning my phone light from shelf to shelf, constantly impressed by the pristine condition of the radios on them, and occasionally stopping to admire a few. I was so distracted that eventually it dawned on me that I had no idea how long I had been down there. I had no idea how far I had walked. Hell, I had no idea where I even was. All I knew was I had been walking away from the stairs. But that was my only clue as to where I was in this colossal space. I stopped walking to get my bearings and shined my phone light in all directions around me. It didn't illuminate much, but as far as I could tell, it was shelves in every direction. It was so faint at first that I thought it was my imagination, but as I quieted my breathing and listened closely, I could definitely hear a noise. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in the distance and slightly left of the direction I was walking. I couldn't tell what it was, but against my better judgment, I started walking towards it. As I got closer and closer, my gut started to tell me more and more that I should just turn back and leave. Well, I still had the chance. As I got even closer, I could hear better what the noise was. It sounded distinctly like static. My gut twisted as I rounded the corner of a shelf, and I saw what was making the noise. It was a radio, and it was on. The dial light cast a pale yellow light into the darkness around it. An empty static blared from its speaker. 1,000 questions ran through my mind at once. Who? What? Why? How? Out here? I realized with a jolt that I didn't see anywhere that it could be plugged in. I was genuinely creeped out and took this as my cue to leave immediately and started half walking, half jogging down the roads back in the direction I came. I hadn't made it more than 10 feet when I once again stopped. I could hear more static, but this time it was closer. I peeked through a gap in one of the shelves, and I saw another radio on in the adjacent shelf. The same empty static coming out of its speaker. I unconsciously backed away towards the shelf behind me, and I started to mentally prepare myself to sprint as fast as I could back to the stairs. But before I could even move, a click and a loud pop of static from right behind my head made me jump out of my skin. I fell to the floor in shock, dropping my phone in the process. I felt around in the dark with shaking hands, and luckily I found it. I got up and looked at the spot where I was just standing to see that there was yet another radio that was on. I knew I had to get out of there as fast as I could, but in that moment I was petrified with fear. I started slowly walking backward, as that was the only thing that my shaking legs would permit me to do. And as I did so, I started hearing more clicks and more static come from all directions around me. I continued walking backwards, hearing more clicks and seeing more dial lights cast an eerie yellow glow into the darkness. And all the while the sound of static was getting louder and louder. Suddenly, I heard a much louder click to my left. I jumped in fear and slowly turned my head in the direction of the sound, afraid of what I might see. My heart dropped into my stomach as I saw what had made the sound. Every single radio on the shelf next to me was on, the dial light shining like yellow eyes in the dark. This time I ran. I ran so fast that my feet barely even touched the floor. Don't ask me how I knew, but in that moment, I knew if I didn't get the hell out of there, I would never leave the basement. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't care. I just ran back in the direction of the stairs as fast as my legs could possibly take me, somehow managing to keep a hold of my phone, which was my only source of light. I heard loud clicks follow me as the shelves behind me turned on in unison, and it was catching up. The more I ran, the closer the clicks got behind me, until they were only one row away. My lungs were burning and my legs were about to give out when I caught a glimpse of it in the light of my phone. It was the back wall, the one perpendicular to the stairs. Seeing this, I took on a burst of speed I never knew I had in me, and I practically slammed into it. I turned and ran to the left along the wall, as I knew I would eventually reach the stairs. My body was already starting to give up, and I could feel myself slowing down, but I knew I had to keep going. I risked stealing a glance to my right at the shelves, and saw that every single radio was on. The static was now deafening, and I could only imagine that every single radio in the entire basement was on. I looked back ahead of me and saw that I was only about 5 rows of shelves away from the stairs. It was at that moment that I felt I might actually make it out. I was about 20 feet away from the stairs when it happened. I noticed the static got quieter all of a sudden, and then I heard it. A voice. It was a deafening, loud, screaming voice, distorted with static. and it came out of the speaker of every single radio in the entire basement. Help me! I scrambled up the stairs like a frantic little kid and slammed the door as hard as I could. I didn't stop and rest until I had pushed those metal shelves back in front of the door. I fell down to the floor and struggled to fill my burning lungs with oxygen. I eventually sat down on a chair and tried to make sense of what had just happened, but my mind drew a blank. There was just no explanation for any of it. The seemingly never-ending basement, the radios turning on by themselves, or that horrifying voice I heard coming out of them. Hey, are you okay? I thought I heard a door slam back there, said John, as he walked into the shop. He gave me a worried look as I tried to get my breathing under control. I debated whether or not to tell him what had just happened, but I ended up telling him the whole story. I expected him not to believe me, but when I finished, he just sat and stared at the wall. He had gone pale, like he'd seen a ghost, and his hands were shaking. John, are you okay? I asked him, putting my hand on his shoulder. It happened last year, said John, finally speaking. Tana was here in the shop, working on something, when he needed a part and had to go down to the basement to find it. I was conducting a guided tour, and I didn't notice he hadn't came back up until it was time to close the museum for the night. You mean to say, I began. Just to be sure, we checked on the security cameras, and it clearly showed him going down, but he never came back up. Of course, we went down there to look for him, but when we went down there, we noticed the lights didn't work. I remember we all felt like we needed to get out of that basement, but we couldn't put our finger on it. After that, we got the police involved, but he was never found. He just disappeared without a trace down there. That's why I hid the door and started telling people that there wasn't a basement at all. Hell, the newer staff don't even know to begin with, and it's going to stay that way. What is that place? How is it so big? I don't understand it, I asked him frantically. If I knew, I'd tell you. It was built long before this place became the museum it is now, and the shelves were already there. We had a lot of connections back then, and to be honest, we acquired way more radios than we needed, through donations and the like. So we just put them all down there. The weird part is, he said, lowering his voice a little, I don't remember it being very big when we originally put the radios down there. It seemed to get a little bit bigger every time one of us went down there, until eventually it seemed endless. We sat in silence, not saying anything after that. After about 10 minutes, he looked at his watch and said, we better close up. I said goodbye to John and my friends and drove back to the hotel. The incident and the story John told me still fresh in my mind. I've been back to the museum once since that incident took place, and I was happy to see that the entrance to that hellish basement had been completely sealed up. Just a plain white wall was left where the door used to be. Me and John never talk about what happened, and if anyone asks about Tana, we say he died in a car crash. I still think about that day all the time, and I still can't make sense of any of it. But one thing's for sure, that basement is some kind of anomaly, and Tana was its first victim. I firmly believe that if I hadn't made it to those steps when I did, I would have been next. A haunting on the coast of Washington State. I apologize ahead of time. This is a lengthy one. First, some backstory about the location itself. Near the touristy town of Ocean Shores, Washington, my great-aunt and uncle own a small motel 2 miles down the road. They live across the street in a home that has seen many uses over the years. The building is around 100 years old and has been a home, a shop, and even a gas station at one point. Currently, they live there with their 2 dogs and 2 cats. Now, there was a lady who lived here years ago who was a caretaker for an old woman whom had moved out to this area over 100 years ago. Both of these women died in that house. For this account, the woman who was a caretaker is the important one to remember. My great-aunt has always been more sensitive to ghosts and more receptive to visitations and experiences. So naturally, this house has provided many. My aunt believes that the spirit who currently resides in the house is that of the woman who was a caretaker. She is a playful spirit sometimes, especially when she wants someone to know she is there. Sometimes my aunt will be cooking, listening to music with her Bluetooth speaker, and the song will change suddenly or the speaker will turn off completely. My aunt will laugh and say it's because the spirit didn't like the music, and she will simply tell the spirit, "Stop that! I was listening to that song," and the spirit will stop messing with the speaker. She seems to be intrigued by new technology that they bring into the house. Sometimes, people staying in the bedroom that was the spirit's room in life will notice their cell phone light up at night, like when you bring up an iPhone to your face or touch it. And I mean light up when there is no notifications or reasons why it should light up. When my aunt and uncle got a new microwave, since they hadn't had one initially when they moved in, they installed it in the kitchen underneath the cupboards and hanging over the stove. That same night, my aunt heard this weird beeping noise that she was unfamiliar with, like someone pressing buttons on something. It was only her and my uncle in the house, and they were both in bed. The next morning, my uncle went to go heat up something in the microwave and started pressing the buttons. My aunt gasped, realizing that was the noise she had heard the previous night. One time, they hired an electrician to install some wiring in the house. This man must have been a bit psychic himself. For some reason I'm not aware of, he had to do some work in the attic. When he went to go to do his work, he came out a few minutes later and asked my aunt, "Ma'am, is your house haunted?" My aunt looked at him, surprised he would ask that, and said, "Well, yes it is. Why do you ask?" He had apparently opened the hatch to the attic, brought the ladder down, and looked up to see a woman in white, staring down at him. He had promptly and calmly gone to find my aunt, to, of course, notify her of what he had seen. She was not surprised, telling him that the spirit was simply curious what he was doing with her house. He ended up finishing his work no problem after my aunt told the spirit he was allowed to be there. Another time, my cousin, my great-aunt's daughter, was in the guest room, which happened to be the previous bedroom of the spirit that supposedly haunts the house. She was getting ready for bed when she noticed that someone was taking a step behind her every time she took a step around the entire room. She screamed and ran out to my aunt, telling her, "She's bothering me, Mom." And my aunt simply told her to tell the spirit to stop bothering her. She did so, and that was that. Now, more recently, I was spending the night at my aunt's place with my girlfriend and our dog. Of course, we stayed in the guest room, the spirit's former bedroom. I was a bit nervous, knowing what goes on at her house, but I knew that the spirit would do nothing to hurt us. It was the first night we were there, and it was bedtime. My girlfriend had gone into the room about an hour before I had, our dog in tow. I stayed up a bit later to watch a movie with my aunt. I had been dreading going to bed in that room, merely because I was terrified pretty easily by the paranormal. Around midnight, I finally went to bed. I came in the room, and she had fallen asleep with the lamp on. I found that odd, but thought nothing of it, really. I turned the lamp off and got in bed, a little freaked out by how dark the room was, as there was no street lamps outside and no other lights at all. We were pretty much in the middle of nowhere. I did not sleep well at all that night. All night long, I heard various noises that would keep me up, and I had several odd and nightmarish dreams. I heard footsteps in the room, knocking on the wall behind the bed, and other weird noises. I was not the only one. My dog heard the footsteps too, standing up every once in a while to see who was walking around in our room. There was no one there every time I got the courage to check. Some noises I could explain, like the door to the bathroom opening when my aunt or uncle would get up in the middle of the night. But there were many I had no explanation for, especially the footsteps. Sometimes it was like pacing back and forth in both the room and in the hallway outside the room. In one of the dreams I had, there was an old woman standing over me, wearing a dress I could barely make out, as the room was dark. She was just standing there, staring at me, with eyes that were hollow, black holes. Even now, I'm not sure if it was a dream or not. Needless to say, we slept with the lights on the rest of the time we were there. What is it about Washington State? It seems like a huge percentage of serial killers have ties to Washington State, having either lived there for a good portion of their lives or being from there. Is there something about it that makes people psycho? I am from there and lived half my life there as an adult. I can tell you my emotional state is so much better off in a state with 300 days of sun compared to 300 days of gray skies and rain. Just a little thought that ran through my head as I noticed more and more killers had connections to Washington. Anyone else notice this? Thoughts? America's most prolific serial killer as far as confirmed victims and convicted counts, Gary Ridgway. Washington was his playground. A walk in the woods. Years ago, I was sitting in a booth in a restaurant, and two guys were sitting in the booth behind me. I overheard one of the guys tell this story. It was a dark, moonless night. I was walking alone on an old logging road deep in the wilderness of Washington State. Suddenly, I heard the sound of a speeding vehicle approaching from behind. Before I could react, I was caught in its headlights. The decrepit jalopy screeched to a halt. There were 4 creepy men in the car, and the driver asked me what I was doing out there in the middle of nowhere, in the middle of the night. I told him I was just walking, and he told me to get in the car. I declined his invitation, and he angrily insisted that I get in. I politely replied that I preferred to walk. "Suit yourself," he said, and slowly drove away. The car disappeared around a curve, and a voice deep within me said, "Run!" I hurried down the bank and hid behind a big boulder about 100 feet below the road. Just then, I heard the car speeding back towards me. It stopped right above me, and I heard 4 doors slam shut. I could see headlights and the men standing by the car. "Where are you?" one of them screamed. "You better get up here right now, or we're coming into the woods after you. If we find you, we're going to slit your throat and bleed you dry." The 4 of them lumbered down the bank, heading in my direction. My heart was pounding, but I stayed put. They were about 50 feet away from me when they turned around and climbed back up to the road. Thank God, it was pitch black dark, and they couldn't see me. They all piled back into the car and sped away. I stayed hid behind the rock for a good hour or more, then climbed up the hill and continued walking down the road, shaking like a leaf in a tree.